Crystal chandeliers shimmered above a dining table long enough to seat a king. The Chambers estate seemed to have been carved from old money, with white marble floors, velvet curtains, and portraits of ancestors who wore power like perfume. Laughter echoed through the grand hall, smooth and polished, the kind of laughter that belonged to people who never feared hunger, judgment, or consequence. At the far end of the room, a woman in a neatly pressed uniform placed silverware with practiced precision. Lena. Her dark skin glowed under the golden lights, her movements quiet and graceful. To the Chambers family, she was invisible, or worse, a background prop in their performance of wealth. "Careful with that crystal, dear," said Mrs. Chambers, her voice dripping with sweetness that stung. "It's worth more than your yearly salary." The guests chuckled politely. Lena smiled faintly, a professional's smile, the kind you wear when dignity is all you have left. Her fingers didn't tremble, not even when Mr. Chambers, with a smirk that could curdle milk, added, "She's got steady hands. Must be all that practice polishing silver since birth." A ripple of laughter filled the air again, except from one end of the table. Dr. Meredith Cole, a woman in her 50s dressed elegantly, didn't laugh. She watched Lena. Not the way one looks at a servant, but the way one studies a storm before it breaks. "Tell me," one guest said, swirling his wine, "do you ever wish you'd been born into a life like this?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Lena looked up. Her voice was calm, smooth, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut crystal. "Sir," she said softly, "some lives aren't born. They're built. One choice, one scar, one lesson at a time." A pause. The table went silent. Mrs. Chambers forced a laugh to break the tension. "Well, isn't she poetic?" Dr. Cole's eyes lingered, her expression unreadable. Something about Lena's tone, her vocabulary, her confidence, didn't fit the uniform she wore. And as dessert arrived, the first crack appeared in the Chambers' flawless facade, because tonight their laughter was about to turn into disbelief. Long before she ever touched a serving tray, Lena Warren stood at podiums. Her voice once filled lecture halls, not dining rooms. She was Dr. Lena Warren, a professor of sociology at Howard University, a mind that studied power, prejudice, and the quiet violence of inequality. Her students adored her. Her papers on racial bias and systemic privilege were quoted across universities. She believed in reform, in empathy, in conversation, until the system she taught about came for her own life. 5 years ago, Lena's husband, Marcus, was arrested for a crime he didn't commit, a robbery gone wrong in a neighborhood he merely passed through. Despite airtight alibis and witnesses, the police report painted him as the suspect. A fit description, they said. Black, male. Near the scene. That was enough. Lena fought the case, spending every dollar, every ounce of faith she had. But justice is a language not everyone is allowed to speak fluently. Marcus was sentenced to 8 years. By the time the verdict was read, Lena's academic world had already turned its back. Donors pulled funding. Colleagues stopped calling. Her name, once revered, had become a quiet caution. "She's emotional," they whispered. Too political, bills piled up. Tenure dissolved. And one day, a letter arrived. Not from a university, but a domestic work agency. Lena folded it neatly, as if accepting defeat required dignity too. She began working under aliases, small towns, short-term contracts, always temporary. Her philosophy degree and her resume gathered dust. At the same time, she ironed shirts and served wine to people who assumed she'd never read a book. She listened to their small talk about self-made, success, and lazy workers. She smiled as if she hadn't written dissertations on the very myths they repeated. By the time she arrived at the Chambers estate, she no longer introduced herself as Dr. Warren. She became just Lena, the maid with calm eyes and a silent grace. The Chambers family lived on legacy, old oil money, old pride. Mrs. Chambers often said she treated staff like family, though her version of family came with boundaries made of glass. Their son, Ethan, 21 and spoiled, mimicked his mother's tone when speaking to Lena. "You missed a spot," he'd say, holding up a plate that didn't need cleaning. Lena endured it all with quiet precision, because she'd learned that silence can be a strategy, and knowledge, a weapon best kept hidden. When the Chambers announced a dinner for distinguished guests, Lena volunteered to help, though she didn't have to. She wanted to observe, to listen, to see up close what privilege looks like when it doesn't know it's being watched. And as fate would have it, among those guests was a name she recognized, Dr. Meredith Cole, sociologist, author, and one of the keynote panelists she once shared a stage with years ago, a woman who knew her work. But tonight, Dr. Cole saw only a maid, and Lena wasn't ready to reveal herself. Not yet, because sometimes the truth has to tiptoe before it roars. The Chambers mansion had never looked so immaculate. Every crystal glass gleamed, every napkin folded like origami, every candle standing at perfect height. Mrs. Chambers had spent 2 weeks preparing for this dinner, a night meant to impress. The governor's advisor, 2 business magnates, and Dr. Meredith Cole, the visiting academic, would all be in attendance. "Lena, make sure the silver cutlery is spotless," Mrs. Chambers said, without looking up from her clipboard. "And for heaven's sake, no humming tonight. This isn't a jazz bar." "Yes, ma'am," Lena replied softly, polishing the last glass until her reflection stared back. Calm, unreadable. The room smelled of rosemary and roasted lamb. Laughter drifted from the parlor as the guests began to arrive, their shoes tapping on marble like polite applause. Mr. Chambers greeted each one with the warmth of a politician, his smile stretched just enough to convey power without humility. When Dr. Meredith Cole entered, he introduced her with theatrical pride. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the great Dr. Cole, author, professor, thinker, and tonight's guest of honor." Applause followed. Lena stood quietly by the doorway, hands clasped. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Dr. Cole's gaze softened, as if recognizing something, but the moment passed. As the evening unfolded, the conversation shifted from politics to social issues, the polite code for topics that people with money discuss when they want to appear informed. "Frankly," said Mr. Chambers, slicing into his steak, "people make too much of this racism thing. If you work hard, you succeed. Simple as that," a few guests nodded. One laughed. Mrs. Chambers added, "Yes, we all start somewhere. I mean, Lena here," she gestured toward her maid without shame. "She's proof of that. She's doing quite well for her background." The laughter that followed was sharp, brittle. Lena didn't flinch. She placed a bowl of asparagus on the table and replied in a tone smooth as glass, "Thank you, ma'am. I believe everyone does the best they can with the systems they're given." The sentence landed heavier than expected. Dr. Cole's fork paused mid-air. One of the advisors raised an eyebrow. But Mrs. Chambers laughed, masking discomfort with arrogance. "Oh, she's clever too. Isn't that sweet?" Ethan, their son, leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Hey, Lena, do you ever wish you didn't have to serve people like us? Or is it fun to watch from the sidelines?" The table chuckled again. Lena's hands tightened slightly on the wine bottle. But she poured, steady as ever, and said, "Perspective is a privilege, Ethan. Some people only see from the top. Others learn from every level." The words rippled like wind through glass. Dr. Cole tilted her head, studying Lena now. There was cadence in her speech, rhythm, intellect, the way scholars speak when they choose simplicity without losing depth. "Lena," Dr. Cole said gently, You have a way with words, Lena smiled faintly. Just listening, ma'am. People say the most interesting things when they think no one is paying attention. A beat of silence followed. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum quietly. Mrs. Chambers broke it again with forced laughter. Well, we like our help to have a bit of character. Keeps things lively, doesn't it? The tension eased into polite chuckles, but the atmosphere had shifted. Dr. Cole's eyes lingered on Lena as though trying to unearth a memory. By dessert, the jokes grew thinner, the laughter more forced. Lena's quiet strength was unsettling, in a room built on fragile superiority. She excused herself to the kitchen, where the clinking of silver turned into a soft symphony of thought. For the first time in years, she felt that something was about to change, that perhaps the night would finally expose the masks people wear when they believe power makes them untouchable. Back in the dining room, Dr. Cole took a sip of her wine, eyes narrowing in contemplation. She remembered a conference years ago, a young professor who had spoken about servitude as a mirror of society's moral decay, and her name had been Dr. Lena Warren. Her pulse quickened. Could it be? The dinner progressed with the same rhythm of opulence, laughter, crystal, and arrogance dressed in politeness. Yet under the glitter, something darker brewed. Every bite of lamb and every swirl of wine carried the aftertaste of what had already been said. Jokes dressed as compliments, curiosity disguised as cruelty. In the kitchen, Lena stood motionless for a moment, breathing slowly. She could still hear them through the swinging doors, their laughter echoing, careless and shallow. Her reflection stared back at her in the oven glass. Calm eyes, steady hands, but beneath them, years of silence pressed like gravity. She whispered to herself, "You've survived worse storms than this." Then she smoothed her apron, adjusted her collar, and returned to the dining hall. Composed, unreadable. As she re-entered, Dr. Meredith Cole's gaze followed her like a shadow. The older woman leaned slightly forward, watching how Lena walked, with posture, not submission. She was certain now there was something familiar about that quiet authority, that precision of movement that scholars never quite lose. Mr. Chambers was midway through a story about his father's hard work, building their fortune from oil investments. People today don't understand sacrifice, he said, with the confidence of someone who'd never known hunger. My father always said, success is about discipline, not handouts. Lena, refilling a guest's glass, paused just slightly. It was enough to draw Dr. Cole's attention again. Wouldn't you agree, Lena? Mrs. Chambers said, a teasing lilt in her voice. You people value hard work, don't you? The room froze. Everyone knew what she meant. You people. Lena turned her head slowly, her eyes soft but sharp as steel beneath candlelight. I do, ma'am, she said gently, though sometimes the definition of hard work depends on who's writing the history books. The air went still. One of the advisors coughed to break the silence. Mr. Chambers forced a chuckle. Well, aren't you a philosopher? Dr. Cole's lips curled into a faint smile. Indeed, she murmured. Lena's composure unnerved them. They had expected the kind of obedience money buys, not dignity that stands taller than a paycheck. Mrs. Chambers raised her glass. Let's not get too serious. Tonight's about celebration. And Lena, do fetch the Bordeaux from the cellar. The good one. Yes, ma'am, Lena replied. As she walked away, Dr. Cole's mind raced. Lena Warren. She remembered reading her paper. The invisible framework. Race, labor, and the myth of merit. It had stirred debate in every academic circle that year. She remembered the speech, the passion, the poise, the voice that silenced a room full of cynics. Could this really be her? Minutes later, Lena returned with the bottle, her steps silent. As she poured the wine, Mr. Chambers decided to offer a toast to his guests. To progress, he said, raising his glass. to a world where everyone knows their place and plays it well. The guests laughed nervously, unsure if it was humor or honesty. Lena paused, then met Dr. Cole's eyes, and for the first time that night, she spoke not as a maid, but as herself. "Funny," she said quietly. "In sociology, we call that a false hierarchy. It's the illusion that order exists because one side believes they deserve the top." Every head turned. The governor's advisor stared. Mrs. Chambers's smile faltered. Dr. Cole exhaled slowly. There it was. The vocabulary. The cadence. "Where did you learn that?" Mrs. Chambers asked sharply. "You read a book on your day off?" Lena tilted her head. "Several, actually." Dr. Cole leaned forward. "Would you mind telling me your full name, my dear?" Lena hesitated, sensing the trap of timing. Then, with the faintest smile, she said, "Just Lena, ma'am. That's enough for tonight." The table erupted in nervous laughter again, desperate to smother discomfort. But the balance had shifted. For the first time, they were the ones uneasy, and she was the calm center of the storm. After dinner, as the guests moved toward the lounge, Dr. Cole excused herself and found Lena in the kitchen stacking plates. "Lena," she said softly, "I've read your work." Lena froze. The clatter of porcelain ceased. Dr. Cole continued, "You don't belong here. Not like this. You were one of the sharpest minds in your field." Lena smiled sadly, drying her hands on her apron. "Belonging," she whispered, "is another illusion, Doctor. Some of us stopped waiting to be invited back to the table. We built our own." Dr. Cole's eyes glistened. "Then maybe it's time they saw who's really serving them." Lena looked at the dining room through the doorway, at the glitter, the glass, the arrogance pretending to be grace. "Not yet," she said, "but soon." She lifted another plate, her posture serene. "The truth deserves the right audience. And in the next hour, that audience would get the performance of a lifetime. Not from the Chambers family, but from the woman they believed was beneath them." The chatter from the dining room had dimmed, replaced by the muffled clinking of glasses and the low hum of jazz music from the record player. The guests had migrated toward the parlor, unaware that the air they left behind still quivered with tension. This lingering lingers after someone speaks the truth, where it isn't welcome. In the kitchen, Lena stood alone beside the sink, staring out the small window into the dark garden. The reflection that stared back at her wasn't a maid's. It was a woman who once stood before audiences and challenged systems that people like the Chambers pretended didn't exist. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from restraint. Years of being quiet had trained her muscles to hide what her mind wanted to scream. The kitchen door creaked open softly. "Lena!" It was Dr. Meredith Cole. Her tone was cautious but warm, the kind of voice that doesn't demand answers, it invites them. Lena turned, forcing a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am? Can I get you something?" Dr. Cole shook her head. "No, I came for something else." She hesitated, glancing at the empty plates on the counter. "You're not fooling me." Lena's breath caught. "I'm not sure what you mean." The older woman stepped closer. "You're Dr. Lena Warren, aren't you?" Silence. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound between them. Finally, Lena lowered her gaze. "That name doesn't open doors anymore." Dr. Cole exhaled, relief and sadness tangled in the same breath. "I thought I recognized your words. That paper you wrote on structural power? It changed my entire approach to teaching." Lena's lips curved faintly. "And yet here I am, serving dinner to people who think equality is a punchline." Dr. Cole's eyes softened. "You don't belong here, my dear." "I didn't belong there either," Lena whispered. "Not after my husband's trial. One accusation erased a decade of work. Universities stopped calling. Friends disappeared. I stopped trying to explain myself." Dr. Cole's expression darkened. "Marcus Warren. I remember the case. It was everywhere in the journals. They used you as an example of how the system eats its own. Lena's eyes shimmered. Yes, and I kept teaching, quietly. Just not in classrooms anymore. She gestured toward the dining hall. Every family like them is a study. Every insult is a thesis. Every silence, a publication they'll never read. Dr. Cole smiled through tears. Still a sociologist, even now. Always, Lena replied softly. For a moment, both women stood there in the dim light, united by understanding, two scholars, two generations, bound by the same truth. The world loves a voice of reason until it comes from the wrong color, the wrong mouth, the wrong class. Dr. Cole touched Lena's shoulder gently. Let me help you. I can... Lena shook her head. No, tonight the lesson isn't yours to give. It's theirs to learn. A beat passed. Dr. Cole's voice dropped to a whisper. Then I'll make sure they listen. Lena smiled, not out of pride, but out of quiet purpose. Thank you. Just let it unfold naturally. The truth has better timing than I do. Dr. Cole nodded and stepped back toward the dining hall, her heart heavy yet alive. Behind her, Lena stood still, framed by the kitchen light, apron tied like armor, calm as if she'd already rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Because tonight wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation, and when it came, it would dismantle every assumption built on polished lies and golden chandeliers. The night had deepened. Outside, the crickets sang beneath a silver moon. Inside, the chamber's dining hall glittered under chandeliers, though the laughter had dimmed to a self-conscious murmur. The wine had done its job. Tongues loosened, masks cracked, and truths began to leak between sips. Mrs. Chambers clinked her glass. Before we move to the lounge, I'd like to make a little announcement. Her voice trembled with delight. As you all know, our dear friend Dr. Cole has come all this way, and we are honored to have her as our special guest tonight. She's quite the mind. Applause fluttered through the room. Dr. Cole smiled politely, but her attention stayed on the kitchen door. And, Mrs. Chambers continued, to make tonight memorable, we've invited a keynote speaker to join us after dessert, someone who understands the importance of dignity, work, and service. She grinned at her guests, utterly proud of her own performance. But alas, she said with mock regret, it seems the poor dear hasn't arrived yet. Lena's voice floated gently from the doorway. Oh, I think she has. Every head turned. There she stood, no longer holding a tray, bowing her head. Lena's apron was neatly folded over her arm, her back straight, her eyes steady as stone. She had changed into a simple navy dress, modest, elegant, yet commanding. The silence was deafening. Mrs. Chambers blinked. Lena, what are you... Dr. Cole rose from her seat, her voice firm but calm. Allow me, everyone. I want to introduce you properly. She turned toward the room. This is Dr. Lena Warren, author, sociologist, and one of the brightest minds I've ever had the privilege to meet. A collective gasp rippled across the table. Forks clattered. One guest actually coughed up wine. Dr. What? Mrs. Chambers stammered. Dr. Lena Warren, Dr. Cole repeated, savoring each syllable. She's the keynote you were waiting for. The very scholar whose work on racial inequality has been quoted by half the universities represented here tonight. Lena stepped forward, voice even, gaze unflinching. Good evening, everyone. The room went still, Mr. Chambers' face drained of color. This is some kind of misunderstanding? Lena interrupted softly. No, sir. I assure you, I've been here the whole time, listening, learning, observing. Mrs. Chambers fumbled for composure. But why pretend to be? Lena smiled faintly. Pretend? She glanced at the folded apron in her hand. I wasn't pretending, Mrs. Chambers. I was serving. I've done that before. In classrooms, in communities, in courtrooms. The uniform changes, but the lesson doesn't. The guests looked at one another, unsure whether to apologize or vanish. Dr. Cole gestured to a chair. "Dr. Warren, please, take your seat." Lena paused. "Thank you, but I'd rather stand. It feels truer that way." A slow, tense quiet fell over the room. Even the clinking of crystal seemed too loud now. Lena's gaze swept across the table, over the faces that had laughed at her, dismissed her, called her dear, and you people. "When you mocked me earlier," she began, her tone low, steady, "I saw not cruelty, but habit. The habit of superiority. The kind that hides behind charm, behind laughter, behind expensive wine." Mrs. Chambers flushed. "We were just being yourselves," Lena finished for her. "And that's what makes this moment so valuable." Dr. Cole folded her hands, eyes glistening with quiet pride. Lena continued, "I took this job not out of desperation, but out of research, to understand how people behave when they believe no one important is watching. Turns out, everyone becomes honest when they think they're above the room." Gasps rippled again. A few guests lowered their eyes in shame. Ethan looked away entirely, his earlier grin long gone. Mrs. Chambers's voice shook. "So this was an experiment?" Lena nodded. "In a sense, a human one. And tonight, you've all contributed beautifully." Dr. Cole rose again, her voice carrying authority. "And I, for one, am grateful you did. Because what we've just witnessed is living proof of how easily education, class, and privilege crumble when humility is absent." Lena looked around one last time. "Dinner was lovely," she said quietly. "But I think it's time we serve something richer. Truth." The guests sat in stunned silence, their reflections shimmering in the untouched wine glasses. And for the first time that night, the Chambers mansion, built on money, pride, and illusion, finally felt small. For a long moment, no one dared to move. The once booming dining hall now felt like a courtroom. The chandeliers above, the only witnesses. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, shimmering between embarrassment and revelation. Mrs. Chambers was the first to speak, her words trembling between defensiveness and disbelief. I think this has gone far enough," she stammered. "You've humiliated us in our own home." Lena turned her gaze toward her, calm, almost kind. "Humiliation isn't what I came for, Mrs. Chambers. I only returned what was served." The line struck deep. A guest coughed awkwardly. The governor's advisor stared at his plate, tracing invisible lines with his fork. Mr. Chambers straightened in his chair, red with anger. "You deceived us. You pretended to be someone you're not." Lena met his eyes steadily. "On the contrary, I revealed exactly who I am. The question is, why did that truth only offend you after I changed clothes?" A murmur spread across the table. Dr. Cole folded her arms, watching silently, like a judge waiting for the verdict to form itself. Mrs. Chambers's voice rose an octave. "We welcomed you into our home." "And I thanked you for it," Lena replied softly. "But hospitality isn't kindness when it depends on ignorance. You were kind to who you thought I was, not who I am." Ethan, who had been quiet till now, finally blurted, "You tricked us." "That's messed up." Lena turned toward him, her tone level, almost motherly. "No, young man, you tricked yourself. The moment you thought service meant less. The moment you laughed without realizing who was listening." He sank back into his chair, cheeks flushing. One of the other guests, an older woman from the university board, cleared her throat. "Dr. Warren, why would you put yourself through this? Surely there are better ways to make a point." Lena smiled faintly. "You can't teach empathy from a podium. People don't listen when they think the lesson isn't about them. But tonight, every one of you looked right at it and saw yourselves." The room shifted. Shame, confusion, realization. They were no longer a dinner party. They were a mirror, and Lena held it steady in her hands. Mrs. Chambers tried to regain her authority, clutching her pearls as if they were a crown. "You speak of empathy. But you've made us look like fools. Only to yourselves, Lena said gently. The truth doesn't embarrass people. Their reactions to it do. Dr. Cole finally spoke, her voice rich and calm. Perhaps it's time we listen instead of defending. Tonight isn't just about discomfort. It's about growth. And growth never happens in comfort. Silence. A heavy, meaningful silence, Lena continued. You believe wealth makes you powerful. But power without perspective is just fragility in disguise. You think you've built empires, but your walls keep out more than they protect. You mistake pity for generosity, manners for morality. Her words were steady, but everyone struck like thunder. Mrs. Chambers's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. You have no right to speak to us this way. Lena took a breath, deep, deliberate. I have every right. I've lived beneath your assumptions, scrubbed your mirrors, folded your illusions, and smiled through your prejudice. I've seen the world from beneath its own hypocrisy. And tonight, you saw me. The chandelier's light caught the edge of her navy dress, a halo of defiance around quiet grace. Dr. Cole rose and placed a hand on Lena's arm. You don't have to say any more. But Lena shook her head. I do. Because this. She gestured toward the table, toward the crystal and the shame. This is what change looks like. Ugly, uncomfortable, real. A few guests lowered their eyes. The advisor muttered something about leaving early, but Dr. Cole's sharp glance kept him seated. Mrs. Chambers tried one last time to recover her composure. Well, Dr. Warren, if you wanted to make an impression, you certainly have. But perhaps next time you can do so without deceiving good people. Lena's response was soft. Too soft for the venom beneath it. Good people don't need deception to reveal who they are. No one spoke after that. Even the music from the parlor seemed to fade, as if the house itself was ashamed. For a long while, they sat in silence, their reflections flickering in crystal goblets like ghosts of their own self-image. The night's grandeur had wilted, replaced by the raw scent of truth. Then Lena stepped back, folding her apron neatly over her arm again. I'll leave you to your evening, she said. But I hope, next time you laugh at someone's expense, you pause long enough to wonder who might be listening. She turned to go, but Dr. Cole stopped her. Lena, she said softly, stay. You deserve the last word. And the seat at the table you were denied. Lena hesitated, then slowly took the chair at the head of the table, the one reserved for Mr. Chambers. The symbolism hung heavy. Mr. Chambers said nothing. Neither did his wife, and in that silence, something profound happened. For the first time in the Chambers mansion, a black woman sat at the head of the table. Not as help, but as authority. The illusion of hierarchy cracked completely. And through that fracture, the truth began to pour. For the first time that night, the room looked different. It wasn't the chandelier or the marble or the silk curtains. It was the way people were sitting. No longer upright in arrogance or reclined in superiority. Now they sat still, small, stripped of illusion. Lena, Dr. Lena Warren, sat at the head of the table, her hands folded gently. She didn't look triumphant. She looked patient. The kind of patience that comes only after years of being misunderstood. Dr. Cole sat beside her, silent but proud, her presence steady like a pillar holding up truth itself. Ethan avoided her gaze, fiddling with his napkin. The older guests stared into their glasses, trying to swallow their shame with the last of the Bordeaux. Finally, Lena spoke. When I was a child, she began softly, my mother worked for a family like this one. She polished their floors, washed their linens, and smiled when they laughed at her accent. I used to think she was weak for enduring it. But now I know she wasn't enduring. She was observing. She understood something I didn't. That the people who need to feel superior are already imprisoned by their own insecurity. Mrs. Chambers flinched slightly, as though the words had touched a nerve. Lena continued, her tone even. I used to lecture about racism as a structure, not just words, but the systems that allow mockery to exist without consequence. Yet I realized something over the years. Racism isn't built by evil people. It's built by ordinary people who never question their comfort. Dr. Cole nodded subtly. A silent amen. One of the guests, a senator's wife, cleared her throat timidly. Dr. Warren, we didn't mean— Lena raised a hand gently. I know. You meant no harm. That's what makes it worse. You see, when cruelty wears a smile, it becomes invisible. You called it manners, humor, tradition. But it was always something darker dressed in fine linen. Her words landed with the weight of truth. Undeniable, immovable. Mr. Chambers finally found his voice, but it came out softer than before. So what now? Do you expect us to apologize? To feel guilty? Lena's expression softened. No, Mr. Chambers. Guilt changes nothing. Awareness does. She leaned forward slightly. The moment you start seeing people as equals, not charity projects, not symbols, not servants, you begin to dismantle the lie that built your comfort in the first place. Ethan looked up, finally, his voice small. We were wrong. Lena's gaze met his. Not harsh, but honest. Yes, but being wrong is how people learn, if they choose to. The boy swallowed hard. I didn't know you were educated. I didn't know who you were. Lena smiled faintly. That's the point, Ethan. You respected me only after you knew my title, not my humanity. And that's how the world keeps repeating itself. Dr. Cole placed a hand on Lena's shoulder. You've given them something no lecture or policy ever could. Perspective. Lena nodded, her eyes distant. Perspective isn't a gift, Doctor. It's a mirror. What they do with it, that's the real test. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was reflective. A silence filled with awareness, not avoidance. Mrs. Chambers finally exhaled, her voice trembling. My son, he's been repeating things he's heard at home. The jokes, the tone. I thought it was harmless. Her words cracked in the middle. But now I see he learned it from me. Lena didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't move. She said, children learn what we live, not what we say. The mother looked at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. The rings, the polish, the privilege that had never known calluses. I thought I was good, she whispered. Kind. Lena's voice was almost tender. Goodness without awareness is comfort. Kindness without understanding is decoration. Tears welled in Mrs. Chambers's eyes. She covered her face, her posture collapsing under the weight of her own realization. Across the table, the guests sat in silence, some in awe, while others felt a sense of guilt. The air was heavy but sacred. Dr. Cole broke the silence with a soft sigh. Perhaps tonight wasn't a dinner, she said quietly. Perhaps it was a lesson. Lena rose from her seat, her voice a whisper, but it filled the room like a hymn. No, she said. It was both. She looked around one last time, her gaze meeting each of theirs. Because sometimes life serves you exactly what you've earned, just not in the way you expected. And in that instant, no one saw a maid anymore. They saw a woman, unbroken, unbowed, and more powerful than any of them could ever be in silk or wealth. The room had turned from gold to gray. The chandelier still glittered, but it no longer gleamed with pride. It trembled with guilt. The faint hum of the record player had stopped long ago, leaving only the rhythm of uneven breathing and the ticking of the clock on the far wall. Lena stood, the glow from the candles drawing long shadows behind her. Her presence filled the room, not through volume, but gravity. Every word, every pause carried the weight of centuries. I once believed, she began, that education could fix everything, that if people understood racism, the history, the data, the pain, they'd want to change it. I taught statistics, sociology, theory, and I waited for the world to listen. However, the truth is that intellect doesn't change hearts. Moments do. Moments like this. Her words hung heavy in the air. No one interrupted. Even the governor's advisor, a man known for interrupting professors on panels, sat in silence, his arrogance folded neatly beside his napkin. Lena continued, voice steady, almost mournful. You all have power, influence, money. Yet, with all that, you still looked at me and saw a servant. Because your world taught you that black women belong in aprons, not in conversations. It taught you that politeness can hide prejudice, and that so long as your words are smooth, your intent doesn't matter. She took a step closer to the table. You think racism is shouting slurs. It's not. It's laughing at the joke instead of challenging it. It's calling someone articulate because you didn't expect intelligence to be so apparent in their skin. It's assuming service defines worth. Mrs. Chambers's eyes shimmered again. Ethan stared down at his lap. Earlier tonight, Lena said softly, you asked if I ever wished I'd been born into a life like this. She smiled, not bitterly, but with aching irony. The answer is no, because everything that makes me who I am, my fight, my resilience, my empathy, was born in the struggle you pity. She placed her folded apron on the table in front of them, as though laying down a symbol of centuries of labor. My ancestors served tables like this, but not because they lacked brilliance, because society refused to see it. And here we are, centuries later, still performing the same play, only with better costumes. Dr. Cole wiped a tear discreetly. Her chin lifted with pride. Mr. Chambers cleared his throat, his voice trembling between guilt and the need to speak. Dr. Warren, I didn't mean to— You did, Lena interrupted gently. But that's all right, because acknowledging what you did is the first honest thing you've said all night. He sank back, ashamed but listening. Lena continued, her tone softening as it grew stronger. Every system survives because good people stay silent. Because comfort whispers, it's not my fight. But every injustice starts as someone's dinner conversation. Dismissed, defended, disguised as humor. She turned toward Mrs. Chambers. You could use your wealth to change lives, fund education, reform policy, and empower workers. But instead, you use it to prove you're better. And every time you do, you become smaller, not richer. The words cut, but they didn't wound. They purified. Mrs. Chambers' lips quivered. You're right, she whispered. You're right about all of it. Ethan lifted his gaze, voice cracking. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I was joking. Lena nodded. You were repeating what you saw. But that's how it begins, with imitation. The next generation copies the prejudice that it's never taught to question. That's why I stopped being angry at racists and started teaching their children instead. Her voice grew gentler now, each word carrying compassion instead of accusation. You don't fix hate with hate. You fix it by teaching empathy so deeply that arrogance can't breathe around it. Dr. Cole smiled softly. You've turned pain into philosophy. Lena met her eyes, tears glinting under the candlelight. Pain is philosophy, Doctor. It's the only kind that stays with you long enough to teach. She stepped back, facing the entire room again. I lost everything once, my job, my husband, my voice. But maybe I needed to lose those things to learn what voice really means. It's not about speaking in halls filled with applause. It's about speaking truth where silence used to live. The guests were silent. Even the air felt reverent now, as if the house itself had bowed its head. Then Lena reached for the wine glass that Mrs. Chambers had filled earlier, the one that had been poured for a maid, not a doctor. She raised it slightly. To those who think service is weakness, she said, her tone a whisper of defiance and grace, May you one day learn that true strength often wears humility's face. No one dared to toast. They watched as she placed the glass down again. Untasted, Mrs. Chambers stood suddenly, tears streaming freely now. "Dr. Warren," she began, her voice shaking, "I can't undo what I said, but I can learn. Please, allow me to start there." Lena studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "That's all anyone can do. Start." Ethan followed his mother's lead. "I'll never forget this. I swear," Lena smiled faintly. "Just remember that awareness means nothing without action. Reflection without change is just another form of vanity." The boy nodded, swallowing hard. Dr. Cole stood then, turning to the table of shaken elites. "What you witnessed tonight is what happens when truth stops waiting for permission. Remember this evening. Let it haunt you, guide you, transform you. Whatever it takes, don't forget it." A hush settled again, but this time, it wasn't guilt that filled the room, it was reverence. Lena took one last look around, her expression soft but resolute. "When I came here," she said, "I wasn't sure if I wanted to teach again. But tonight, I remembered why I started. Because sometimes the world doesn't need another lecture. It just needs to see itself." And with that, she turned, her footsteps echoing across the marble floor. Behind her, the table remained untouched, a feast gone cold. A night forever altered. No one followed her immediately. They sat in silence, the echo of her words still rippling through the air, like the aftershock of truth. And somewhere deep within that silence, something inside each of them began to change, quietly, painfully, beautifully. Morning light fell through the tall windows of the Chambers mansion like judgment wrapped in forgiveness. The grand dining room, once echoing with laughter and privilege, was now still. The silver trays remained untouched, the napkins rumpled, and the wineglasses stood half empty, as if the night itself had refused to finish what it started. Lena was gone. In her absence, the silence felt alive. It lingered like the scent of truth, something that could not be polished away. Mrs. Chambers stood alone at the table. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the polished wood. And for the first time, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. The confidence, the poise, the pride, all of it looked like a costume she'd outgrown overnight. Her husband entered quietly. The lines under his eyes were deeper, his voice smaller. "The papers," he said. "They've already printed the story." Mrs. Chambers turned. "What story?" He hesitated, then slid the morning paper across the table. On the front page was a photo taken by one of the guests. Lena standing at the head of the table, Dr. Cole beside her, light spilling over them like divine justice. The headline read, "Black Scholar Humiliated by Social Elite, Then Teaches Them a Lesson They'll Never Forget." Mrs. Chambers's knees weakened. "Dear God," her husband sighed. "We'll be mocked for this." "No," she said quietly. "We deserve to be." 3 days later, Mrs. Chambers called a press conference. Cameras flashed. The crowd murmured, waiting for the woman who had become a symbol of hypocrisy to speak. She stepped to the podium. No pearls this time, no expensive scarf, just a plain navy dress. "3 nights ago," she began, voice trembling, "I believed myself to be a good person. I thought I was fair, kind, and decent. And yet, I mocked a woman who has done more for the world than I ever will, because she was serving at my table. I tell you this because wealth doesn't cleanse arrogance, and education doesn't guarantee empathy. I have both, and I still failed to see a human being standing before me." Her words spread across every network, every social feed. For the first time, the Chambers family didn't trend for their luxury, but for their repentance. Behind the cameras, Dr. Cole watched silently. She had convinced Lena to let the moment unfold, to allow the lesson to ripple where it needed to. Far from the noise of the city, in a quiet community college hall, Lena stood before a chalkboard again. The air smelled of paper, ink, and second chances. "Welcome," she said softly to her students, adults, many of them domestic workers, nurses, and janitors. "This class is called Social Systems and Dignity. It's not just about learning how the world works. It's about learning why we must never stop questioning it." Her new program, funded anonymously by Dr. Cole and, later by a surprising donor, Margaret Chambers, became a cornerstone for women who had been overlooked, silenced, or dismissed. Lena never told them what happened that night in the mansion. She didn't need to. The lesson lived in every word she taught. Each guest from that evening carried the memory in a different way. The senator's wife started a scholarship for underprivileged girls in her state. The advisor who had laughed the loudest resigned from his post and joined a civil rights foundation. Even Ethan, a young, spoiled, and untested individual, began volunteering at Lena's college. He carried trays, stacked books, and wiped boards. "It's not charity," he told her once when she thanked him. "It's education," Lena smiled. "Good! You're finally learning in the right direction." He laughed a little nervously. "You're still teaching me lessons, aren't you?" "Always," she said, "until you no longer need them." Months later, Lena was invited to speak again, this time on national television. The interviewer asked, "Dr. Warren, what did you take away from that night at the Chambers estate?" Lena thought for a moment before answering. "I learned that humility doesn't live in mansions. It lives in moments. That racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smiles. And that power isn't measured by who sits at the head of the table, but by who deserves to." The interviewer leaned in. "And forgiveness?" Lena smiled faintly. "Forgiveness isn't for those who ask. It's for those who learn." The Chambers family learned. "That's enough for me." Back at the mansion, Mrs. Chambers had kept one thing unchanged: the dining table. But at its center, beneath the chandelier, stood something new, a small brass plaque that read, "May every meal served here remind us who we once were, and who we chose to become." She would never again dine without remembering the woman who dismantled her arrogance with grace. Lena never sought revenge. She sought reflection. She proved that dignity is louder than insult, that silence can be strength, and that every act of prejudice carries within it the seed of awakening. Her story became a lesson passed from home to home, a mirror held up to every heart that ever thought less of someone because of their place, their skin, or their uniform. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't begin with protests or politics. They begin with a dinner, a question, and a woman brave enough to answer it. The camera pans slowly across the quiet mansion, chandeliers dimmed, the echo of laughter replaced by the hum of reflection. Outside, dawn breaks across the marble terrace, golden light seeping through the windows as if the universe itself were forgiving what the night revealed. A voiceover begins, Lena's voice. Calm, steady, human. People often ask me if I was angry that night. The truth is, I wasn't. Anger burns fast. I wanted something that lasted longer. I wanted them to see, not me, but themselves. To see how prejudice wears perfume, how arrogance dresses in silk, how cruelty can hide behind charm. The scene shifts. Flashes of the dinner replay like ghosts. The laughter, the mockery, the stillness that struck the room when the truth was revealed. Then the voice continues. We live in a world where titles decide respect, and uniforms decide worth. But someday, someone will walk into your life wearing neither power nor pedigree, and how you treat them will say everything about you. Cut to Mrs. Chambers, standing before a classroom of young women at Lena's college, reading from a textbook. The students listen. Lena passes by the doorway, smiling quietly before walking on. Change doesn't happen when you shame people, Lena continues. It happens when you show them who they could be, and then give them the chance to try again. The camera now follows Ethan, older and wiser, volunteering at the same college. He's scrubbing floors this time, humming to himself. A young janitor passes him, and he nods respectfully. The smallest gestures, done in humility, carry the most significant meaning. Dr. Meredith Cole's voice fades in gently, overlapping Lena's narration. Empathy, she says, isn't learned from comfort. It's born from collision, the moment your certainty meets someone else's truth. Soft piano begins to play beneath the words, a gentle and emotional accompaniment. We see Lena at her desk, writing, the same poised woman who once stood under chandeliers now surrounded by sunlight and books. She closes her notebook and looks out the window. Children are laughing in the courtyard below. Students helping one another, lives intersecting with kindness instead of hierarchy. That night taught me something, Lena says. That respect isn't owed to titles, it's owed to souls. That wealth fades and beauty fades, but how you treat people, that's your legacy. And sometimes, the most significant lesson a person can learn is realizing they were the student all along. The screen fades to black. Then one line appears in white letters, simple and powerful. Sometimes the people you look down on are the ones teaching you how to stand tall. Lena's voice returns one last time, soft as a closing prayer. So next time you meet someone serving your table, cleaning your floor, or standing quietly in the corner, remember this: you don't know their story, you don't know their strength, and you might just be sitting across from the person who's about to change your world. The piano swells gently as the end title fades in. Then, a final screen. If this story moved you, share it. Because empathy begins with awareness, and awareness begins with stories like this.